What did you draw upon to accurately predict the financial crisis of the late 2000s, and at the time, how certain were you of this prediction?
Well, I drew on historical knowledge, because I'm not an economist, I'm an economic historian, and what I was doing was teaching about the Depression, writing a lot about financial crises. I'd spent much of the preceding 10 years studying 19th and 20th century financial history, and I detected all the warning signs of a bubble in 2006. So towards the end of 2006 I was arguing that there almost certainly was going to be a bust, a liquidity crisis that would take highly leveraged institutions down. So that was the kind of approach. How certain was I? I was pretty certain, actually, yeah. I mean, I was certain when, particularly at one moment, when a hedge fund manager bet me, this was in early 2007, that there would never be another recession in the United States. And he bet quite a lot of money. And I said, well, if people are prepared to make bets like that, then we've entered this time it's different territory where people have convinced themselves something has fundamentally changed, and of course it hasn't. So I was absolutely sure. And indeed, it happened a bit sooner than I expected. I was furiously writing The Ascent of Money, hoping that it wouldn't happen so that my book would predict it. And of course, it happened before the book came out.
Well, your research has chronicled the rise and fall of various empires, including Great Britain and the United States. So what so-called empire is on the rise today, or is the concept of an empire a relic of the past?
Well, in some ways the terminology of empire is a relic of the past, and nobody wants to own it anymore. Only a few wild-eyed neoconservatives in the Bush administration used the empire word. And indeed, since the end of World War II, it hasn't been an acceptable term. On the other hand, when you look at the way the United States operates in the world today and where it operates as a military presence, or when you look at the way in which China has risen and China exerts its power, it's pretty clear that there are at least two empires in the world today. Anybody who doubts that there's a Chinese imperialism hasn't been to Tibet. And so, although the terms empire and imperialism are anachronistic, I think the conceptual tools are helpful, because I think we can compare these empires with previous empires and learn from that comparison what's different about them and what's not different. So that's really my approach. It's not designed to upset people and enrage them. It's just that we don't have much else to go on if we're trying to understand large, powerful states than the history of empires.
Okay. And I guess my last question is, can you give us a quick preview of your upcoming book, Civilization, the West and the Rest?
Well, I shall be doing that in my lecture tonight, but very briefly, this is a history of how the world shifted from the rest to the West after about 1500. And the first question is, why was that? Why did the West come to dominate the world? And the second question is it over? Are we living through the end of Western ascendancy? And what does that mean? What's its significance? It's a book that takes an institutional approach. I don't explain the rise of the West in terms of the weather, geography, or national character, or any of those old suspects. I focus on institutions that made Western states more successful economically and in other ways than non-Western states. And the point I make is that the six things that made the West predominant are no longer monopolized by the West. And that shouldn't therefore make it very surprising that the rest are catching up, and catching up very fast.
So would that relate to the earlier comparison you made between the two empires, so-called empires that exist today, China and the United States?
Well, one reason for writing Civilization was to move the conceptual terrain away from empire towards civilization, because one of the striking things about the American-Chinese rivalry is that it is a rivalry of civilizations. Certainly the Chinese see themselves as a civilization state that can export Confucian values through institutions abroad. And of course the United States is a civilization state which exports a set of values as much as it exports soldiers or drones. So I think civilization is a useful concept, and maybe historians who tended to spend a lot of time on nation states in the last, I guess, 100 years should be thinking a little bit more about civilizations again. Because, as Sam Huntington said back in 1993, in the post-Cold War world, it's a kind of contest, not a clash necessarily, but a contest between civilizations. And so that's why I've shifted the emphasis. Of course there's a connection, and in some senses these two terms are overlapping. A really well-organized civilization with a lot of military capability is probably an empire.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.